The town square buzzed with life as merchants called out their wares. Children ran between market stalls, and the aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the scent of lavender from a nearby flower stand. It was a scene of ordinary life, filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of coins. But for Amelia Fordham, this was more than just an afternoon errand. This was a rare moment of escape. Dressed in an elegant sapphire blue gown, Amelia walked through the marketplace with a grace that turned heads. The daughter of Alexander Fordham, the wealthiest man in town, she was a vision of refinement, her golden brown hair pinned neatly in an intricate braid. Vendors greeted her with polite nods, their voices tinged with a mixture of admiration and formality. Despite the warmth of the afternoon sun, Amelia felt a strange chill in her heart. Her life was set before her like a script written in gold, ink, and sealed with expectations. She had been given everything, luxury, education, and social standing, yet something within her longed for more. As she browsed the stalls, her fingers traced the delicate lace of a handkerchief, but her mind was elsewhere. That was when she saw him. Across the square, Thomas Reed stood at his woodworking stall, carefully carving intricate patterns into a wooden jewelry box. His hands, rough from years of labor, moved with precision and care. Unlike the men Amelia had been introduced to at grand parties, Thomas was different. He was real. He glanced up, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. There was no bow of courtesy, no immediate deference. Instead, there was a quiet curiosity. "Beautiful craftsmanship," Amelia said, stepping closer. Thomas set his chisel down, dusting off the fine wood shavings. "Thank you. Hard work and patience create the best results." There was no flattery. In his words, no attempt to impress her with rehearsed charm. He spoke as if she were any other customer, and somehow that intrigued her. Amelia studied the jewelry box in his hands, running her fingers along the smooth, polished wood. "It must take great skill to create something so fine," Thomas gave a small shrug. "Skill, yes, but mostly it takes time. Anything worth having is worth the effort." His words lingered in her mind, stirring something within her. How different. He was from the world she knew, where things were handed down, not earned. Just then, a sharp voice cut through the moment. "Amelia." She turned to see Margaret Ellis, the mayor's wife, approaching with a small entourage of elegantly dressed women. Their eyes flickered between Amelia and Thomas with thinly veiled amusement. "What are you doing here?" Margaret asked, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Surely there are better places for a lady of your standing to shop." Amelia straightened, feeling the invisible chains of expectation tighten around her. She was supposed to smile, to nod, to return to her world without question. But when she glanced back at Thomas, she saw the quiet understanding in his gaze. He knew that she did not belong entirely in their world, nor did she quite belong in his. Still, she forced a polite smile and stepped away. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Reed," she said. Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. "Likewise, Miss Fordham." As she walked away, Amelia felt the weight of Margaret's gaze on her back. The moment had been brief, insignificant to most, yet something had shifted within her. That night, as she sat by her bedroom window overlooking the twinkling lights of the town, she found herself thinking not of the grand estate she lived in, nor of the wealthy suitors her father spoke so highly of. She thought of a simple wooden jewelry box and the man who had made it. The cool night air carried the distant sounds of music from the grand Fordham estate. A grand ball was in full swing, with gentlemen in fine suits and ladies adorned in jewels twirling across the polished marble floors. Candles flickered in golden chandeliers, casting a warm glow over the room, and laughter echoed between the towering columns. Amelia Fordham sat by the large bay window, watching but not truly seeing. The room was filled with luxury, Yet she felt confined, suffocated by the expectations pressing down on her like the corset around her waist. Another evening, another gathering of suitors, another reminder of the life planned for her. Amelia. "Dear, Lord Whitmore has been asking for you," her father, Alexander Fordham, said as he approached, his voice laced with expectation. "He is a fine man with wealth and power. He would make a suitable match." Amelia forced a smile. "Of course, father," she said, rising gracefully. But in her heart she knew she did not love Lord Whitmore. As the evening dragged on, Amelia excused herself from the ballroom, slipping through the garden doors into the cool night air. She needed space, she needed air, she needed something real. And then, as if fate had heard her silent plea, she saw him. Thomas Reed stood by the garden's edge, his presence unexpected, yet undeniably welcome. He was dressed simply, his hands still rough from the day's work, but his eyes, his deep, thoughtful eyes, held something that no man in that ballroom possessed. "You shouldn't be here," Amelia whispered, glancing toward the house. Thomas smirked. "And yet here I am, just as you are." She exhaled, stepping closer. "If my father sees you—" "He won't," Thomas interrupted, his voice calm. "And even if he does, I don't care." Amelia's breath hitched. His confidence, his defiance against the very rules that bound her, sent a thrill through her chest. "Why are you here, Thomas?" "Because I needed to see you." His voice was softer now, honest. "Because no matter how hard I try to push you from my mind, I can't." Amelia swallowed, her heart hammering. She should have told him to leave, should have walked away, but she couldn't. Instead, she looked into his eyes and saw everything she had ever longed for: freedom, passion, love. "This is dangerous," she murmured, but she did not move away. Thomas took a step closer. "Then tell me to go." Amelia opened her mouth, but no words came. She didn't want him to go, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not wealth, not status, not the world that would never approve. She lifted her hand, and Thomas took it, his fingers wrapping around hers, as though they had always belonged together. "This can't end well," she whispered. "Then let's not think about the end," he said, his voice gentle. "Just this moment." As the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of laughter from the ballroom, Amelia Fordham and Thomas Reed stood in the shadows, hearts racing, lost in the forbidden love that neither could resist. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the town square, where the sounds of merchants calling their wares mingled with the chatter of townsfolk. Amelia Fordham walked briskly through the cobbled streets, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from excitement. Wrapped in a simple cloak, she had slipped away from her father's estate before anyone could question her. She was going to meet Thomas. As she turned the corner past the blacksmith shop, she spotted him near the carpenter's workshop. He was hard at work, sleeves rolled up, sawdust clinging to his clothes. The sight of him, strong, capable, unburdened by wealth yet full of purpose, made her heart ache with longing. Thomas looked up and saw her. His lips curved into a smile, and he quickly set down his tools. "You came." "Of course I did," Amelia whispered, glancing around cautiously before stepping closer. "I couldn't stay away." He took her hands, his touch warm and grounding. "One of these days, someone will recognize you. You know the risk, don't you?" She nodded. "But it's a risk worth taking." They walked together toward the riverbank, their secret meeting place. Here, away from judgmental eyes and rigid expectations, they could simply be themselves. Thomas sat on a fallen log, pulling Amelia down beside him. "Your father would have me run out of town if he knew," Amelia sighed. "He believes love is something that must be calculated, that it must come with titles and land and power." She turned to him, eyes filled with emotion. "But I don't care about those things, Thomas. I care about you." Thomas swallowed hard. He had always known Amelia's love was real, but to hear her say it so openly sent a shiver through him. You deserve a life of comfort, Amelia. I can't give you what your father expects." She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "What you give me is more valuable than all the riches in the world. I don't need gold. I don't need status. I need you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The river flowed beside them, a gentle melody filling the space between their words. Then Thomas took a deep breath. "If you truly want to be with me, Amelia, then I'll fight for us. No matter what your father does, no matter what the world thinks, I will fight for us." Amelia's heart soared. She cupped his face, her thumbs brushing against his cheek. "Then we'll fight together." He leaned in, and their lips met, a soft, stolen kiss filled with promises, with dreams, with a love that refused to bow to the odds stacked against them. But as the wind rustled through the trees, Amelia knew their battle had only just begun. The grand chandelier in the Fordham Estates dining hall flickered with golden light, casting long shadows across the table where Alexander Fordham sat, his jaw tight, his eyes cold with disapproval. Across from him sat Amelia, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her knuckles were white from gripping her dress beneath the table. "Enough of this foolishness, Amelia," her father said, his voice sharp as a blade. "You are to accept Lord Whitmore's proposal. He is a man of standing, of wealth, everything you deserve." Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. Lord Whitmore was nearly twice her age, dull and indifferent, interested only in securing a match that would expand his business empire. The thought of marrying him made her stomach turn. She lifted her chin, her voice steady but firm. "I do not love Lord Whitmore." Alexander slammed his fist against the table, the force rattling the silverware. "Love? Love is for fairy tales, Amelia. This is about security, about our family's legacy." Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "What about my happiness? What about my heart?" Her father exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Your heart is not practical." He leaned forward, his voice lowering to something more dangerous. "And neither is your infatuation with that carpenter boy." Amelia's breath caught. He knew. She had been careful. She had only met Thomas in secret, always making sure no one saw them together. But somehow, her father had found out. "Yes, I know," Alexander continued, reading the shock on her face. "Did you think I wouldn't? The town whispers, Amelia, and I will not have my daughter ruining this family's reputation over a man who can offer you nothing." Amelia stood so quickly that her chair scraped against the floor. "He is not nothing," she said fiercely. "Thomas is kind, hard-working, brilliant, more of a man than any of those noblemen you parade before me." Alexander's expression darkened, his patience snapping. "You will end this, Amelia, tonight." Her pulse roared in her ears. "I will do no such thing." Her father's nostrils flared. "If you defy me," he said slowly, "then you will leave this house. You will leave everything behind, your inheritance, your status, your family name." The words struck like a blow. She felt the weight of them sink deep into her bones. Was this truly what love demanded of her? To give up everything she had ever known? Her hands trembled as she took a step back. "If that is the price I must pay to be with the man I love." She swallowed hard, lifting her chin. "Then so be it." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with years of expectation and duty crashing against the unyielding force of her love for Thomas. Then her father nodded, slow and deliberate. "Very well," he said coolly. "You've made your choice. You're no longer a Fordham." The finality of his words sent a shiver down her spine. With one last glance at the house she had called home for her entire life, Amelia turned on her heel and walked away. She did not know what awaited her beyond those doors, only that Thomas was out there, waiting for her, and no matter how painful this moment was, she knew her heart had already chosen. The Fordham estate stood eerily silent that night. The usual air of grandeur and control that Alexander Fordham commanded had been replaced with an uneasy stillness. Amelia was gone. It had been 2 days since she left. 2 days since she had walked out of the grand estate, leaving behind her inheritance, her status, and most painfully, her father. Alexander had expected her to return, to come crawling back once the harsh realities of a life without wealth set in, but she hadn't. Instead, whispers had spread through town. The heiress who had abandoned her fortune for a common carpenter. Some mocked him, some pitied him, but all agreed on one thing. The great Alexander Fordham had lost control of his own daughter, and that infuriated him. Sitting alone in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, Alexander stared at the roaring fireplace. His wife Margaret entered quietly, her eyes filled with sadness. She had remained silent when their daughter left, but now she could no longer hold back. "Alexander," she said softly, stepping closer, "you must bring her home." He scoffed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "She made her choice. She is a daughter," Margaret pressed. "You banished her from this house over love, over pride." He set the glass down with a sharp clink. "No, Margaret, I protected her. That boy, Thomas, he has nothing to offer her." Margaret sighed, sitting across from him. "And yet she chose him over all this. What does that tell you?" Alexander's jaw tightened. He knew what it meant, but he refused to say it aloud. Margaret's voice softened. "I went to see her today." His head snapped up. "You what?" "I went to town," she admitted. "I found her staying at a small cottage near the river. She's happy, Alexander." A small, wistful smile touched her lips. She was laughing, genuinely laughing. Alexander's fingers curled into a fist. The image of his daughter, living in some meager shack with a man who had no fortune, no name, no legacy. It was unthinkable. Margaret reached for his hand, her touch warm. "She doesn't care about the money, the status, or the power. She only ever wanted love. And if we do not accept that, we will lose her forever." Alexander yanked his hand away, rising to his feet. "I built everything we have from nothing, Margaret. Everything. And she throws it away for a carpenter?" He shook his head. "No, she will learn. She will see that love is not enough. And when she does, she will come back." Margaret stood as well, her voice no longer gentle but firm. "And if she doesn't?" Alexander didn't answer. He simply turned back to the fire, watching as the flames flickered and danced, much like the fire in his daughter's heart, wild, untamed, and unwilling to be controlled. But as the silence stretched between them, a sinking feeling crept into his chest. What if Amelia never came back? The town square bustled with activity as merchants called out their prices and townsfolk moved about their day. But amidst the usual clamor, Thomas Reed walked with a purpose, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent the last few days consumed with thoughts of Amelia. Though she reassured him she had no regrets about leaving her father's wealth behind, Thomas knew she had given up everything for him. And while his love for her was unwavering, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to prove himself, not just to Amelia, but to the world. As he turned onto a quieter street, he found himself standing before the grandest building in town. Fordham Industries, the empire built by Alexander Fordham himself. The empire that now faced a looming threat. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The reception hall gleamed with elegance, a stark contrast to Thomas's modest attire. He felt the weight of the curious and judgmental stares from clerks and officials. As he approached the main desk, "I need to speak with Mr. Fordham," he said, his voice steady. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, looked him up and down before scoffing. "And you are?" "Thomas Reed." The name alone sent murmurs through the office. Everyone knew who he was. The carpenter who had stolen Amelia Fordham away. The woman smirked. "Mr. Fordham isn't expecting you." Thomas set his jaw. "Then tell him I have a way to save his company." That got her attention. Minutes later, he was led through the grand double doors of Alexander Fordham's office. The man himself sat behind a heavy mahogany desk, his sharp blue eyes narrowing the moment he saw Thomas. "You have some nerve," Alexander said coldly, setting down a stack of financial documents. Thomas didn't waver. "I came here with a proposition." Alexander scoffed. "A proposition? From a man who has nothing to offer?" "On the contrary," Thomas replied, "I have exactly what you need." Alexander folded his arms, intrigued despite himself. "And what might that be?" Thomas stepped forward. "I know about Caldwell's plan to take over your company. His strategy is aggressive, and the way things stand, your business is at risk. But I've been studying the market trends, the trade routes, the supply chains. There are solutions you haven't considered yet." A tense silence stretched between them. Alexander leaned back in his chair, eyes scrutinizing the younger man. "You expect me to believe a carpenter knows more about business than I do?" Thomas met his gaze unwaveringly. "I expect you to listen, because whether you like it or not, I'm the only one willing to help you." For the first time, Alexander truly looked at Thomas. He wasn't the poor, love-struck boy he had dismissed before. He was confident, intelligent, and, most infuriatingly, right. Leaning forward, Alexander spoke slowly. "And what do you get out of this?" Thomas took a steady breath. "If I help save your empire, you give Amelia and me your blessing. No more interference, no more trying to take her away from me." Alexander's fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk. The thought of trusting Thomas with his business was unbelievable. But the alternative, losing his empire, was even worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he smirked. "You're either incredibly foolish or incredibly ambitious," Alexander said. "Either way, you have one chance. Impress me." Thomas nodded. "I won't fail." As he turned to leave, Alexander called out, "Oh, and Thomas, if you do fail," his smirk turned razor-sharp. "You'll lose more than just my daughter." Thomas swallowed hard, but didn't hesitate. "Then I guess I have no choice but to succeed." And with that, he walked out, ready to take on the biggest challenge of his life. The weight of the moment pressed down on Thomas as he sat in the study of his modest home, surrounded by stacks of notes, maps, and business reports. A single candle flickered, casting shadows on the wooden walls. He had one chance to prove himself, to prove that he was more than just a poor carpenter. The proposal he had laid before Alexander Fordham was bold, but it was risky. If he failed, he wouldn't just lose his shot at earning Alexander's respect, he would lose any chance of a future with Amelia. Amelia sat across from him, watching his furrowed brow as he pored over the documents. She reached for his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to do this, Thomas," she whispered. He looked up at her, his gaze steady. "Yes, I do. Not just for us, but for your father's company. If it falls into Caldwell's hands, countless families will suffer. This is bigger than just us, Amelia." She squeezed his hand. "Then I believe in you." The next morning, Thomas arrived at Fordham Industries, stepping into the grand meeting hall where Alexander sat with his board of advisors. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to outright skepticism as Thomas took his place at the head of the table. Alexander leaned back, arms crossed. "You asked for this chance, Thomas. Let's hear what you have." Thomas took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began. "Caldwell's takeover strategy is built on undercutting your supply chain and forcing your partners to sell him their shares. But what if we change the game?" The room fell silent as Thomas laid out his plan. We shift production to the smaller, independent suppliers in town. They've been struggling because Caldwell has been targeting larger suppliers with buyouts. If we invest in them instead, we rebuild local support, reduce dependency on external providers, and regain control over pricing. One of the advisors scoffed. "And how do you propose we do that without capital?" Thomas didn't miss a beat. "By liquidating the company's underperforming assets and redirecting the funds. You have warehouses sitting unused, properties that aren't generating income. Sell them, invest in the suppliers, and regain control of your production." Alexander's eyes narrowed as he considered the proposal. "And what about Caldwell's boardroom influence?" Thomas smirked. "That's the best part. If we restructure and offer employee ownership to key managers, we secure their loyalty. They won't sell out to Caldwell if they have a vested interest in the company's success." A murmur spread through the room. Alexander drummed his fingers against the table. "It's a bold plan." "It's the only plan," Thomas countered. For the first time, Alexander looked at Thomas with something other than contempt. There was a spark of respect. Days turned into weeks as Thomas worked tirelessly with Alexander's team. He traveled to the smaller suppliers, convincing them to take a leap of faith. He met with warehouse managers, negotiating deals that freed up capital. He fought against Caldwell's looming shadow, countering each of his moves with strategic precision. Amelia watched from the sidelines, filled with pride. Thomas was no longer just a carpenter. He was a man shaping the future, but Caldwell was no fool. One evening, as Thomas walked through the town square, he found himself face to face with the rival businessman. "You've made quite the name for yourself, Reed," Caldwell said, a smug grin on his face. "But don't think for a second that you've won." Thomas met his gaze unflinching. "We'll see about that," Caldwell chuckled. "Ambition is admirable, but in the real world, money wins." Thomas leaned in slightly. "Maybe, but loyalty and hard work build something money can't buy. Trust." Caldwell's smile faltered for the first time. Weeks later, as the final pieces of the plan fell into place, Caldwell attempted one last desperate takeover, but it was too late. The company had been fortified, secured by the people who now had a stake in its survival. The board voted unanimously against Caldwell's acquisition. The empire stood strong, and at the heart of it all was Thomas. That evening, in the dimly lit office of Fordham Industries, Alexander sat across from Thomas in silence. Finally, he spoke. "You did what I never thought possible." Thomas met his gaze. "I did what was necessary." Alexander sighed, nodding slowly. "And you did it for Amelia." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I would do anything for her." A long pause. Then, to Thomas's surprise, Alexander extended his hand. "You've earned your place, Thomas." Thomas shook it firmly, and with that handshake, a legacy was not just saved, but transformed. The golden glow of the evening sun bathed Fordham Manor as Amelia stood by the grand balcony, gazing out over the estate. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming roses from the garden below. Everything had changed. The empire had been saved. Her father's business was secure, and yet, despite all the victories, her heart remained restless. Would Thomas and her father ever truly see eye to eye? Would their love ever be free from the burdens of status and expectation? She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Thomas standing in the doorway. He had come straight from the factory, his sleeves rolled up, his hands still marked with the ink of ledgers and contracts. He looked nothing like the nobleman her father had once envisioned for her, but to Amelia, he was everything. "You're miles away," Thomas said softly, stepping closer. She smiled faintly. "Just thinking." He tilted his head, studying her. "About us?" She nodded. "We've come so far, Thomas. But do you think my father will ever truly accept us?" Thomas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "He gave us his blessing. That's more than I ever thought possible." But does he believe in us? Amelia pressed. Or does he just see you as the man who saved his company? Thomas reached for her hands, his touch gentle yet firm. Does it matter? Amelia searched his eyes. It does, because I don't just want his approval. I want him to understand that love, real love, isn't about wealth or status. It's about choosing someone, no matter the odds. Thomas smiled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Then we'll show him. That evening, Alexander Fordham sat alone in his study, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. For the first time in his life, he felt uncertain. His daughter's happiness had always been his greatest priority. And yet, for years, he had believed that wealth and security were the only things that could guarantee it. But Thomas Reed had shattered that belief. He had seen firsthand how the young man had fought, not just for the company, but for Amelia. Thomas had risked everything, not because he wanted fortune, but because he wanted a future with her. With a deep sigh, Alexander reached for his coat. It was time to set things right. Thomas and Amelia sat by the fire in Thomas's modest home, lost in quiet conversation, when a knock at the door startled them. Thomas rose and opened it, his expression shifting to one of surprise as he saw Alexander. Fordham standing there. "Mr. Fordham," Thomas greeted, his voice steady despite his shock. Alexander stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. It was small, simple, but warm. A stark contrast to the lavish halls of his own home. "I wanted to speak with both of you," Alexander said, his tone unusually measured. Amelia stood, concern flickering in her eyes. "Papa, is everything all right?" Alexander hesitated, then exhaled. "For years, I believed that money was the greatest gift I could offer you. I thought that by securing your future with wealth, I was ensuring your happiness." He turned to Thomas. "But you proved me wrong." Thomas remained silent, listening. Alexander's gaze softened. "You saved my company, yes, but more than that, you showed me what real love looks like. You stood by my daughter when it would have been easier to walk away. You built something, not for yourself but for her, and for that, I owe you more than just my gratitude." Amelia's breath hitched. "Papa." Alexander turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. "I spent so many years trying to build a legacy, but I see now that legacy isn't about wealth. It's about love, family, and the choices we make." Thomas met Alexander's gaze, searching for any hint of doubt, but there was none. This was real. Alexander stepped forward, extending his hand. "Welcome to the family, Thomas." For the second time, Thomas shook the man's hand. But this time, it wasn't a business deal. It was acceptance. Days later, the town gathered for a celebration, a wedding unlike any other. It wasn't grand. There were no extravagant displays of wealth, no towering floral arrangements or gold-plated invitations. Instead, it was held in the town square, among the people Thomas and Amelia had grown to love. Alexander stood proudly by his daughter's side as she took Thomas's hand, her eyes filled with a love that outshone any riches. And as they exchanged vows under the evening sky, it became clear to everyone watching. True wealth wasn't measured in gold or estates. It was measured in love, trust, and the courage to choose each other against all odds. And that was a legacy worth more than any fortune.